today's video, we are going to briefly be discussing Walker Scott's Klevr Integration Hub product. Now, this product is an integration accelerator, which allows us to quickly design, configure, and deploy integrations, leveraging the power of Azure's Integration Services via the Klevr Integration Hub Accelerator Tool. Now, Walker Scott's beliefs behind integrations is that integrations must be business-led, so integrations must deliver business value. However, they must be developed by engineers. It's also very important that the integration must bake in tooling capabilities, monitoring patterns, and governance so that engineers can be left to focus just on the building of the integrations themselves. And then in today's world, it's important that integrations must leverage secure native cloud services, and it's important that organizations do not get tied in to any proprietary technology. Now, that last point is one of the main points for the Klevr Integration Hub product. It's very important that it's known that the Klevr Integration Hub product is simply the tool that our consultants or client consultants will use to deploy the Azure Integration Services within the client's Azure tenancy. So by using the Klevr Integration Hub product, our client will, at the end of the day, receive a bunch of Azure Integration Service infrastructure into their own tenancy, which is important because it means they're not tied into the use of the Klevr Integration Hub product. If they choose to end their Klevr Integration Hub license, the integrations that have been deployed using the product will continue to work. It's also very important because it means that all of the data that is flowing around remains within our client's Azure tenancy and is protected by their security perimeter. So, looking at the Azure Integration Services that are offered by Microsoft, we can see that there are quite a lot of infrastructure resources that can be plugged together to build a client's needs for integration. So we have things like Logic Apps, Service Buses, API Management, Event Grid, Azure Functions, and then, of course, the Azure Data Factory. Now, there are definitely best practices that should be followed when deploying these infrastructure resources. However, you can deploy these resources in different ways to facilitate your integration needs. However, this requires quite a fair amount of knowledge as to how these underlying resources will behave and how they should be plugged together. And the Klevr Integration Hub product removes a lot of that concern and risk. So before we go any further, we'll jump straight into the demo of how an integration can actually be designed and deployed using the Klevr Integration Hub product. So in this demo, we're going to do a simple upload of a file to an SFTP folder. This is one that's been created within Azure. So I'll just upload a file into this destination. And so we're just doing an XML file here. I'll upload that. And then I'll switch tabs and I'll go into a Logic App that has been deployed using the Klevr Integration Hub product. We can see that the integration in this instance is very simple. So we have an inbound SFTP. So this is essentially a file watcher that is going to continually watch this SFTP location and see if any files are uploaded that match the criteria that have been set up on the file watcher. So we can filter out files by extension, size, and file name. Then we have a very simple transformation step where the incoming payload will get transformed using a liquid template to the expected payload of our downstream target system. And then here we can see we're doing an out API call to an API mocking service on bScepter. Now I'm just going to click into the inbound SFTP and I'm going to manually run this. This would run every 10 minutes as per the configuration, but I won't make us wait around for that today, and we can automatically see that a new run is being triggered. These logs of historical runs are quite important and can be used in combination with application insights and Azure Alert notification to ensure that any issues with your deployed integrations can be reported on and alerts can be sent to the correct destinations, whether that's an email to specified individuals or it might be a post in a Teams channel to make sure that someone at the client side can quickly review, debug, and then update the necessary things to make sure that that expected payload can transmit through the system. So if I refresh this, then we're going to see that this is successfully run. And we can see that our next step is the transformation. So I'll click into the transformation workflow, and we can see that we have our run at 1246, which is transforming the expected payload from the inbound SFTP folder to the payload that our target system is going to expect. And finally, if I navigate to bScepter, we can see that there was a post just 1 minute ago. And if I select that post, we can see the now JSON object that was sent via API management to our API mocking service. Now, this is a really short and simple integration. Integration Hub is excellent at building out simple integrations. However, with all the capabilities within Integration Hub, we can also do some handle some very complex and long integration patterns. So I'm just going to jump to Doxy, where we have our publicly facing documentation. And this is the Integration Hub section. And here you can see all of the different stages, as we call them, for integration. So looking at the integration that we just saw, where we had an inbound SFTP, we have our inbound stages. We have a bunch of different stages available to us based off on where we expect the inbound messages to start. So if your source system can send API messages, maybe it's going to upload information to blob storage. We have the out-of-the-box Dataverse connectors if your source system is a customer engagement application, and there's more. We then have our transform stages, so we can do some fancy things during integration. So we did a transform using a liquid template, but we could also do transform the payload using JavaScript. We can set up date time, so we can do date time conversions, which is also often important when you're doing integrations between different systems that might operate on different date times. And then we can merge payloads together, or we can split payloads, which is useful for handling batch payloads coming into the system or going out of the system. We also support PGP encryption and decryption, which is often useful when sending financial information or other private information from between systems. We have query stages, which allow us to interact with SQL servers. We have routing capabilities where we can route information based on the payload. So when you're receiving payloads from a system, you can look at some attributes on that payload and you can route that either to different transformations or potentially to different systems based on the content of the payload coming into your Integration Hub. You could also delay. So if there needs to be a delay between the inbound or potentially a polling that needs to be set up where there's an expected process that will take some amount of time in an external system, you can set a delay within Integration Hub to cater for that. And then we can also cater for looping, where we repeat a process until we have all of the information required. Klevr Integration Hub also has inbound storage capabilities out of the box, utilizing Cosmos DB within Azure. And finally, we have the ability to send alerts to different webhooks from within Klevr Integration Hub. This documentation is externally facing, so any of our clients can easily navigate to this link and they can find the documentation to see how Integration Hub works. But essentially, each stage of Integration Hub is set up by copying and pasting a very simple JSON definition file into a repository. This repository will then get committed to Azure DevOps, and then a pipeline will be set up that will look at the repository within Azure DevOps, and it will deploy and then do some post-deployment configuration of those resources within your Azure infrastructure. In the case of today's demo, this is the simple repository that was needed to deploy the Azure Integration Services required for our very simple integration. So you can see we have our interfaces. So this is where all of our integrations will live. We can set these up with different business units. So you can have integrations that are grouped by business unit. And then we have our demo, which was the name of the logic app that we were looking at today. Here you can see the JSON definition file for the inbound SFTP workflow. So this workflow was deployed within our logic app, and this is everything that needed to be filled out in order for that to be deployed correctly. Now, importantly, much of this is just copy and paste information. So as a consultant deploying a particular integration, I can copy and paste this JSON definition file into my repository, and then I can just ensure I update the fields that are relevant or different in my integration than the readily available information. But it greatly reduces the amount of time required to deploy something like this. If I were to hand tool this within the Azure portal, it would take much longer. We do have the ability here to pull variables from Azure DevOps libraries. So obviously when you are deploying things into different environments, so you might have a dev, a UAT, and production, your SFTP connection details will be different for each of those environments. And so you can pull this from the variable, allowing you to use the one definition file within each environment. So here's our inbound SFTP JSON definition file. We also have our simple JSON definition file for our liquid transform, which just tells us we're transforming from XML to JSON. This is the source, so it's looking at the inbound SFTP workflow that runs before it. And then here is the location of the liquid template that should be used for transformation. And finally, for our outbound proxy API step, we have our JSON definition file. And you can see here we're setting up the information that is needed to send the transformed payload to our final source system, which was our bScepter endpoint. And here we're defining the base URL and the URL path. And these are once again being pulled from a Azure DevOps library so that we can have our test or production endpoints in those libraries and get pulled at time of deployment. So this setup is all that is required in order for us to get all of the infrastructure required to handle this integration. As you can see, there's much more than just a logic app. We have a service plan to host the logic app. We have our event grids, our function apps, all of the Azure Integration Services that are made available to us from Microsoft. However, the Klevr Integration Hub product will allow you to use those stage definition files to easily design and configure your integrations, and then it will deploy the necessary Azure Integration Services in an opinionated way. But it greatly reduces the amount of time and effort that is required to not only initially deploy your integrations, but also to do ongoing support and monitoring of integration performance. Thank you very much. That's the end of today's quick demo on the Klevr Integration Hub, and we look forward to hearing from you on your integration needs.